I buried my husband 11 months ago. Or so I thought. His name was Gordon. Gordon Allen Whitfield. We met at a church potluck in Sudbury when I was 23 years old, and he showed up with a casserole dish full of store-bought potato salad that he was trying to pass off as homemade. I caught him peeling off the grocery label in the parking lot. He saw me see him, and instead of being embarrassed, he just shrugged and said, "I ran out of time, not effort." I laughed so hard I spilled my lemonade. We were married 11 months later. That was 41 years ago. When the police came to my door on a Tuesday afternoon last February, I was in the middle of making soup, chicken and rice. I remember because I had just added the rice when the knock came, and I thought to myself, I'll have to turn that down in a minute, or it'll stick to the bottom. That's the kind of thing your brain does when it's about to receive news it isn't ready for. It holds on to the ordinary things. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both young enough to be my grandchildren. They told me Gordon had been found at the base of the Vermilion River Trail outside of town. A fall, they said. Blunt head trauma. His wallet was on him, his phone, his jacket with his name written on the inside collar the way I'd done since he started forgetting things. I had written it there myself, in black marker. Gordon A. Whitfield. I turned off the rice, and then I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't say that for drama. I say it because that is what happened. My legs simply stopped working and the floor was there. We buried him on a Thursday in March, when the ground was still half frozen and the funeral home had to work around a patch of ice near the gravesite. My daughter flew in from Halifax. My son drove up from Barrie with his wife and the kids. My sister came from Winnipeg, even though she and Gordon had never gotten along particularly well, and she held my hand the whole time anyway, which I will never forget. 11 months. 11 months of grief that felt like learning to walk again. Everything was wrong. The bed was wrong. The mornings were wrong. I kept buying too much food at the grocery store because my hands remembered shopping for 2, even when my head knew better. Last Tuesday, I was at the Loblaws on Elm Street, the one with the big parking lot that floods every spring. I was in the produce section trying to decide between 2 bags of apples when I looked up, and I saw my husband. He was standing at the far end of the aisle near the bagged salads. He had his back to me. He was wearing a green fleece jacket I had never seen before, but the way he stood, the way his left shoulder dropped slightly lower than the right from the old hockey injury he got in his 30s, the exact gray of his hair above his ears. My body recognized him before my mind could argue. The apple bags hit the floor. I did not notice. He turned to look at something on the shelf, and I saw his profile. The straight nose, the jaw, the slight furrow between his brows he got when he was concentrating. A woman in her 50s appeared beside him and handed him something, a box of something, and he took it and put it in the cart. She was tall, with dark red hair. She touched his arm the way you touch someone you know very well. I could not breathe. I could not move. Someone asked me if I was all right, a teenage boy in a Loblaws apron. I must have looked like I was going to faint. I said yes, I was fine, I just needed a moment. He picked up the apples. By the time I got myself together, my husband, Gordon, the man whose grave I had stood at 11 months ago, was gone. I walked every aisle of that store, twice. I went out to the parking lot and stood in the cold without my coat for 10 minutes. I drove home in a fog so thick I still don't know how I arrived safely. I told myself it was grief. Grief does things to the mind. I knew that. I had read about it, the way loss can make you see people in crowds, in windows, on television. Grief hallucinates. I knew that. But I could not stop seeing the shoulder. The way it dropped. 41 years, and I knew that shoulder the way I knew my own hands. I did not sleep that night. The next morning I called my daughter. She listened very carefully and then very gently suggested I might want to speak to my doctor. She said it with love. I know that. She was worried about me. But after I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about the shoulder. I thought about the red-haired woman. I thought about the way he had taken the box from her, without hesitation, without looking, the way you accept something from someone who has handed you things 1,000 times before. I went back to that Loblaws the following Friday. I told myself I just needed to see the store again, to prove to myself there was nothing there. I walked the produce section. I walked the whole store. Nothing. I was on my way out when I saw a receipt on the ground near the self-checkout. Someone had dropped it. I almost walked past, but something made me pick it up. It was from 3 days before, Tuesday, the day I thought I saw him. The items were ordinary: apples, orange juice, bread, a box of all brand, and at the bottom, under the transaction number, was the Optimum card number. The PC Optimum loyalty number. My husband had a PC Optimum card. He complained about having to carry it for years until they added it to the app on his phone. I am 67 years old and I have never considered myself particularly good with technology. But I sat in my car in that parking lot and I looked at that loyalty card number for a long time. Then I called my son. My son is 40 years old and works in logistics, and he is practical in the way that practical people are, which means he is not always comfortable with things that don't fit into a clear category. When I told him what I had seen, I heard the same careful pause I had heard from my daughter. But I also told him about the receipt, about the number. And the pause got longer. He said he would look into it. He called me back 4 hours later and his voice was different, flattened in a way I had only heard once before, when he called to tell me his father-in-law had passed. He said, "Mom, I need you to sit down." I told him I was already sitting. He said the PC Optimum account linked to a card ending in those digits had been active. The last transaction was 3 days ago, in Sudbury, at the Loblaws on Elm Street. The account was in Gordon's name. I want to tell you that I cried. That would make more sense, wouldn't it? But I didn't cry. I felt something go very still inside me. Very, very still. Like a lake in the middle of winter when the snow has stopped and everything is just silence. I said to my son, "I need you to tell me what you know." He was quiet for too long, and then he told me. He had known for 6 weeks. He said his father had contacted him in November. Said he was alive, said he needed help, said he had made a terrible mistake and didn't know how to come back. My son said he had been trying to convince his father to come forward on his own. He said he hadn't told me because he didn't want to hurt me. He said he had been trying to protect me. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. When he finished, I said, "You knew your father was alive while I was at his grave, while your sister was grieving, while I was learning how to be a widow?" He said yes. I said, "I'll call you back." I put the phone down, and I did something I had not done since Gordon was first declared dead. I went out to the backyard and I sat in the garden chair that faces the cedar hedge, the one Gordon used to sit in to drink his coffee in the mornings, and I let myself feel every single thing there was to feel. It took about 45 minutes. And then I went inside and called my daughter. My daughter took it differently than I expected. She did not make excuses for her brother. She said quietly, "What do you need, Mum?" Just that. No question mark. Just an open door. I said I needed a lawyer. She said, "I'll find you one by morning." Here's what the lawyer told me over the phone the next day, in plain and careful language. Gordon's death had been officially declared. Legal processes had already been initiated around the estate, the life insurance policy through his former employer, his pension through the provincial plan. If Gordon Allen Whitfield was alive, then what had been set in motion was fraud, insurance fraud, estate fraud, depending on how the death had been arranged, and we did not yet know how. There could be criminal charges as well. The question of who else was involved mattered a great deal. My son, the lawyer said carefully, was in a complicated position. I knew what that meant. I want to be honest about this part. I am his mother. He is 40 years old, and I have loved him since before he was born, and I will love him until I stop breathing. None of that changed, but love and accountability are not opposites. And he had looked me in the face at a graveside and said nothing. He had sat across from me at Christmas dinner and said nothing. He had listened to me talk about how I was learning to manage Gordon's RRSP, how I was figuring out the estate process, how I was trying to understand what I was entitled to and what I would lose, and he had said nothing. I called my son back that evening. I told him I loved him and that I was furious with him, and that both of those things were entirely true at the same time. I told him I was going to involve the police. I told him I was not going to ask his permission. He was quiet. Then he said, "I know, Mom. I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." And I called the RCMP the next morning. The officer I spoke to was a woman named, well, I won't use her name here, but she was matter-of-fact in a way that I found helpful. Not cold, just clear. She explained what they would need. She explained what the process would look like. She told me I had done the right thing in calling, and she said it in a way that did not feel like something you say to make people feel better. It felt like she meant it. They found Gordon 11 days later. He was living in a rented house on the outskirts of a small town 2 hours north of Sudbury, with the woman, the red-haired woman from the grocery store. They had been together for 3 years. He had apparently decided that the simplest way to leave a marriage was to leave it entirely, to leave everything, to become, for all intents and purposes, dead. He had arranged it with the help of a hiking accident and a great deal of very specific planning. The details came out slowly over the following weeks, and I will spare you most of them. What I will tell you is that a stranger was never in danger. The fall was staged with enough care that no one else was harmed. And what I will also tell you is that my son had known from the beginning how it had been done. His father had told him everything. When the officers brought Gordon in for questioning, I was not there. I had chosen not to be. My daughter had wanted me to go. I think she wanted to see me have a moment of confrontation, some cinematic reckoning. But that is not who I am. I had said what I needed to say to my son. I did not have anything I needed to say to Gordon that the law was not already saying more efficiently. What I did instead, on the day they found him, was drive to the cemetery. I sat by the grave marker that had his name on it. It was a cold day, gray in the way that February is gray in northern Ontario, the kind of gray that settles into your coat. I sat there for a while, and I thought about the potluck, the grocery label in the parking lot, the casserole dish, 23 years old, and so certain that this man was going to make me laugh for the rest of my life. 41 years of being right about that, I suppose. And then not. I do not know exactly what I felt sitting there. It was not grief. Not exactly, not anymore. It was something more like closing a very heavy door, gently, firmly, and walking away from it without looking back. The life insurance claim was reversed. That process was complicated, and it took several months and involved more paperwork than I care to describe, but the money was returned. The estate was reopened. Gordon's pension was another matter, and that is still, as of now, being worked through by people who understand these things better than I do. My son cooperated with the investigation fully. His lawyer told him that was his best option, and it was. The charges against him were eventually reduced. I am not going to say more about that because it is his story as much as it is mine, and I think he deserves to carry it the way he chooses. We talk on the phone every Sunday now. It is not the same as before. I don't know if it will be, but we talk. My daughter came to stay with me for 3 weeks in the spring. She helped me repaint the living room a color called morning fog, which is a sort of soft blue-gray that I love in the late afternoon when the light comes through the west-facing windows. We cooked together every evening. She made me tell her all of it, every part, because she said she didn't want me carrying it alone. She listened the way she has always listened, completely, and then she said, "You are the toughest person I know, Mum." I said, "I'm not tough." I just kept going. She said, "That's what tough is. I have been thinking about that a lot. Gordon's legal situation is not resolved as I record this. I understand there are proceedings underway. I have chosen not to follow them closely. My lawyer sends me updates when there is something I need to know. That is enough. The red-haired woman, I found out her name eventually, though it doesn't matter. I do not feel what I perhaps expected to feel toward her. I don't know what she knew or when she knew it. That is not my question to answer. The question I did have to answer was this one. Who am I without the 41 years? It turns out I am more than I thought. I have been doing things I had stopped doing somewhere in the middle of all those decades. I take a watercolor class on Wednesday mornings at the community center in the South End. I am not good at it. That's fine. I go anyway. I have been to 2 concerts since the spring, real concerts, not just things Gordon would have tolerated. I drove to Manitoulin Island in August with my sister and her friend, and we stayed in a small rental cabin, and I watched the sun go down over the lake every evening for 5 days, and I thought, this is mine. This moment. This is just mine. I called a grief counselor too, back in the winter when things were heaviest. I want to say that clearly because I think there is still a strange hesitation people have around that, as though asking for help is a confession of weakness rather than a recognition of it. It helped me. It did not fix everything. Nothing fixes everything. But it helped me untangle what I was grieving. Because it turned out I was grieving several things at once, not all of them the same. I was grieving the man I thought had died. I was grieving the marriage. I was grieving the 41 years, which were real, whatever he had made of the end of them. And I was grieving the woman I had been inside that marriage, the woman who organized her whole life around another person's preferences and rhythms without quite noticing how much of herself had been set aside. That woman was not a fool. I want to be clear about that too. She was someone who loved someone fully and without reservation for a very long time. There is nothing foolish about that. The foolishness, if there was any, was not hers. I am 67 years old. I live in the same house I have lived in for 30 years, and I am learning how to make it mine in ways it never quite was before. I planted tomatoes in the garden this summer, the big heirloom ones that take forever and that Gordon said were too much work. They were too much work. They were also delicious. I am not telling you this story because I have figured everything out. I haven't. Some days are still harder than I expect. The holidays last year were, well, they were what they were. I got through them. I am telling you this story because when I was sitting in that grocery store parking lot with a stranger's receipt in my hand, trying to decide whether I was losing my mind, there was a moment where I almost put the receipt down, almost told myself I was imagining things, almost chose the easier explanation. I am glad I did not. I am glad I trusted what I knew. And if you are out there and something in your life is asking you to look more closely at what you've been told, at what you've accepted, at what you've quietly set aside, I want you to know it is not nothing. The thing you noticed is not nothing. Pick up the receipt. I have thought a lot about what it means to reap what you sow. Not in any religious sense, I'm not that kind of person, but in the plain, ordinary human sense. The choices Gordon made did not happen in a single moment. They were made slowly, over years, one small decision at a time, each one a little further from honesty, until the distance became so great that the only exit he could imagine was a fabricated death. That is what dishonesty does when it is left alone long enough. It doesn't stay small. It grows into something that requires more and more of you to maintain, until eventually it takes everything. And Colin, my son, I have not stopped loving him, not for a single day. But I think about what it cost him to carry that secret for 6 weeks, what it did to him to sit across from me at the dinner table, knowing what he knew. He thought he was protecting me. I understand that. But the weight of a lie you're holding for someone else is not lighter than the truth. It's heavier because you carry it alone, and you carry it for reasons that aren't even yours. That is the part I hope he learns. Not that he was wrong to love his father, but that love is not the same thing as loyalty to a lie. What I did not expect, when all of this came apart, was how clearly I could see myself in it. Not as someone who was deceived, though I was, but as someone who had slowly, over 41 years, become very good at not asking certain questions. Not because I was afraid of the answers. I think I simply stopped believing my own observations mattered. Gordon's version of things had weight. Mine was just feeling. That is something I am still working on, honestly, learning to trust what I notice. Learning that the thing my gut said when I saw that shoulder drop in the produce aisle was not grief playing tricks. It was knowledge. 41 years of accumulated bone-deep knowledge. Picking up that receipt was the most important thing I did in all of this. Not calling the RCMP, not hiring the lawyer, not confronting my son. Picking up the receipt, because that was the moment I decided that what I had seen was worth investigating, that I was worth the trouble of finding out the truth. I think a lot of us learn, somewhere along the way, to make ourselves smaller in the face of things we can't explain, to choose the easier story. I almost did, and I am telling you now, from the other side of the hardest year of my life, do not choose the easier story if something in you is saying it isn't the true one. The tomatoes I grew this summer were, as I mentioned, a great deal of work. They were also the best thing I ate all season. I grew them in a garden that is now entirely mine, in a yard I am learning to love again, in a life that is quieter than I expected and fuller than I feared. That is enough. That is more than enough.